Well, you see, it's just not in the United States, right, Steve?
Well, next October, remember, about 30 days before this monumental midterm election, he's going to face, his father, Jair Bolsonaro, is going to face the most dangerous leftist in the world, Lula, a criminal, a communist, and supported by all the media here in the United States, all the left-wing media. This election is the second most important election in the world, right? In the most important elections ever in South America. Bolsonaro will win unless it's stolen by, guess what? The machines.
The machines. We have the president's son, Eduardo, coming here. Bolsonaro, if I say it right, Bolsonaro.
Bolsonaro.
Okay, Bolsonaro. He's going to be coming here to speak in a couple hours, but there are the same things going on in their country.
Welcome, folks. Welcome. Left Reckoning 31. Matt Leck, joined as always by David Griscom. David, how are you?
Man, I'm good. I'm inspired. Mike Lindell really is one of those characters that just makes it very prideful about this country. Just a bumbling idiot who somehow fell sort of ass backwards into fortune.
I can't say he just fell into it. I mean, I've never fallen into one of his pillows. I don't know, what I can't review it. I imagine, it's a pillow. But I will say, I don't know if this is my pillow in the super luxury market, do you think?
I don't think they're that luxurious, are they?
I don't know. We'll find out. Maybe we'll look into that. But I think he's too focused on his political side gig. But I don't know how you've been feeling, David, but I've been feeling extremely luxurious, super luxurious, you might say. Particularly because the luxury consumer markets are just, they're doing really well. And that's a thing I like to keep an eye on to see how the economy's doing.
They're blowing up, man. I mean, it's a good time to be a billionaire. And, the people who have been doing well have been doing really damn well. I think we fall back on this stat a lot, but you just need to keep on harking on it, that since the pandemic began, March 2020, the total combined wealth of American billionaires has increased from 2.9 trillion to $4.7 trillion. I'm sorry, you get confused sometimes because it just is a kind of mind-boggling sum of money. But there are a lot of people who not only didn't suffer during these past year and a half, 2 years, but they did better than they've ever done before.
Well, I mean, I think that's what the way Jeff Bezos has been picking up shifts, for letting...
Jeff Bezos has been manning the lines, making sure the packages get out on time. No, he's been dicking around and, working on going on to space. And that should be, the kind of poster when we remember 2021 is that there's a class of people who really are living on a completely different planet than the rest of us.
Yeah, so this prompted a tweet thread of mine. Started off, this was prompted sort of by national debt concerns that we'll get into with Manchin in a little bit. One thing we could do if the national debt ever starts having negative effects is to take money from rich people and pay for it. There's a yacht market, there's a money tree, and then look at this is just if you Google luxury. Luxury sales turned in an unusually strong first half this year. Can the good times last? The good times, I love that. The good times when luxury markets are doing well. I like the caption here, person wearing a luxury suit in a luxury home. We also have luxury watch sales surging as Britons go on spending sprees. Luxury market update, sales increase. Baldhead home study sales. Global super luxury sales surged in the first half of 2021, and luxury branded condos entice buyers even with no hotels. So yeah, luxury. The times are good.
Times are really good. I mean, that's the thing is, so much of the American markets, I'm honestly, for the past couple of decades, have really been focused on super high-end products, like not just from the kinds of things like stuff like golden toilets, $80,000 pickup trucks. I mean, it's pretty wild to realize the different world that a lot of these folks are living in.
Yeah, like unable to really spend the money and buying properties.
Yeah, they're unable to spend the money, so it's like, who cares? It's not something that they really have to worry about it, which is why it's so ridiculous that we're starting to hear all this rhetoric that we need to start tightening our belts as a country.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe that's a good way to get into this Bidenflation stuff, David.
Mhm.
I mean, I have cavalierly, as somebody with a substantial amount of student loan debt might said inflation is good because that will inflate away my student loan debt.
Mhm.
Now, we have this political article here that we want to talk about. So I guess like my cavalier tweet meets reality a little bit. Who does inflation hurt in America, and does it have to be that way?
Well, I mean, the thing is that inflation, it's one of those statistics or ways of like looking at the economy. I'm just like talking about inflation in general that can sometimes miss the mark, right? Because what really matters is what things are like the prices inflating out of control, right? And there's some truth to what you're saying, Matt. Like for most people, if you don't have a lot of money sitting around in the bank, the fear of inflation sort of erasing all of your savings isn't really as strong as it is for super wealthy folk. And it's certainly beneficial for somebody like you and for like me who is in debt, right? If the total value of what your debt is essentially going down because of rampant inflation, that could be a beneficial thing. But yeah, it's like you don't want to sit around and be cavalier about this because inflation is extremely damaging to society. I mean, just literally from the kind of on a basic level of just stability, right? If you're going to the store and the next, you go to the store and you buy something that costs $5 one week and then it costs $7.50 the next week, all of your interactions start to get very, very difficult. We've seen horror stories in South America, for example, where they're just not even able to update prices on the grocery store shelves because there's just such rampant inflation. But we're nowhere near that in this country. And instead, inflation gets to be a kind of boogeyman, right? And typically when you start hearing the ruling class talk about inflation, what they're talking about is they want the federal government to start disciplining labor and to start making sure that working class people don't have more money in their pockets. But let's get some things straight. Like there have been huge increases in things that Americans buy: cars, used trucks, guns, lumber, and houses, even food. The prices of those things have gone up dramatically in the past few months and year. I'll tell you one thing. There's a very basic explanation for that. It's the pandemic. There were massive crises in supply chains. Some of these things have not really been reckoned with. Think about something like the used car market, right? Typically in the used car market, there's a massive influx every year of rental vehicles that basically get sold, right? And that increases the entire supply of used cars that are in the market. Well, when people weren't really driving around and renting cars for a year, that meant that entire fleets basically were sitting on the lot, right? Which means that there's a huge part of the used car market that usually comes in, a huge supply of used cars that usually comes into the market that did this year, right? That's not the only reason the used cars have gone up, but it's just one of the examples of like all the different ways that the pandemic really affected prices. Inflation is a really tricky beast to tame. It's not. It's also not something that people on the left should ignore. Its causes aren't always super easy to identify. But as I was just saying, the pandemic had a huge influence. Years and years and years of reliance on what was called the just-in-time production system, which meant that things literally were just showing up right as they were needed for production, meant that there became a lot of issues with sourcing the materials that are needed for producing lots of different goods, that we use. Our friends and gamers who are listening to this, I'm sure know plenty of examples of that using computer parts, but obviously that is going off, occurring all across the American economy. The lockdowns really made things wild. And lastly, remember, people really did change their habits because of the pandemic in ways that we haven't really had time for that to change the way that we're producing things, right? A lot of people became DIY, part-time DIY handymen in their houses, which is a big reason why lumber and things like that have skyrocketed in price. I mean, a great example of this, remember what the hell happened to flour? When the pandemic first started, all these people were acting like they were going to become bakers at home. And a lot of these things ended up just being wasted, particularly because the people who have been able to buy up a lot of stuff for the past year and a half have been the relatively privileged few who have been work from home people, which has just meant that there are some things in the economy right now that the prices are wildly high on, right? And other things it's not as strong. So this kind of general narrative of price inflation in the U.S. economy, I think, is a scare tactic that is being used as a bludgeon for more sinister reasons that we'll get to in a second. And if we have this Politico piece up, I think this really highlights the problem here. Price. This is, I think, from this morning, Politico. Price growth is winning the race. Inflation is devouring wage gains. New data shows inflation jumped again in July as price hikes overshadow the benefits of wage gains. We'll go down here. This first paragraph is all that really matters. Rising prices on everything from groceries to gasoline have eaten away the wage gains workers have seen since the start of the year, leaving most Americans earning less than they were before the pandemic began, and derailing the White House's argument that paychecks have grown under Joe Biden's tenure. Prices climbed 0.5% over the month from June to July, a slower pace than in recent months, but still sizable enough that it outpaced the healthy wage gains the healthy wage gains workers across the income spectrum have received. As a result, real earnings decreased 0.1% over the month, government data shows. And this is really notable, I think, to make this point that the kind of inflation that we are seeing is eating into the some of the benefits that workers have received. But let's not forget that they even laid out at the beginning of that paragraph. The White House has argued that their number one goal is not to increase the wages of American workers, right? That has not been the policy. They might try to, sell it in some ways to some people, but when they're talking to, reporters, they're saying something very different in their pitch, which is that they're just trying to get the economy rolling again, not to see some kind of massive shift that would happen if we were basically pushing forward higher minimum wages and things of that nature.
These are choices that they didn't, right? They decided not to pursue the higher minimum wages because they're trying to coerce labor. That's what get the ball rolling means.
Really, that's what this is all about. At the end of the day, is that there were a lot of things that might have created and sort of amplified this moment of increased prices. Right. Notably, the fact that people were getting more money sent directly to them for the first time in many people's lives. Right. And that was a good thing. And they should have been doing that more. Right. But what's happening right now is there was not this kind of structural reshuffling and redistribution of power in the workplace or higher wages that were going to last through inflation. Right. For American workers. There were temporary injections of cash, which again were good, and we needed a hell of a lot more of that, right? Yeah. But that is a reason why people were able to spend a little bit more. Well, what we're seeing right now is this clamoring and this demanding that there's tightening, right? Which is why you and I have been making this point on the show from the get-go, that one thing you really need to notice about the Biden administration is that they're not making things permanent. And they're not doing things that are going to have lasting structural benefits for American workers. They're doing kind of temporary influxes of cash and everything with sunset provisions, right? Basically things that will go away in a few months. And that has created a really, really dangerous situation for American workers.
Yeah, I mean, this is the joke we used to make back when Yang was running for president about landlords for UBI, right? Like in the absence of any kind of structural changes where you decommodify these essentials, it's nice to give money away, but it's immediately going to get soaked up by rentiers.
Yeah, and look at some of the major benefits. Like we've talked about, the direct payments, right? That's good. Child tax credit, that's great too. That should be made permanent and expanded. But then look at other things. We got the eviction moratorium, not rent forgiveness, student debt freeze, not cancellation, right? That is an example of the temporary nature of a lot of these programs, right? That does not set up working people to be stronger as a class in the long haul. And the reason that this is really critical that we don't get lazy about this talking point is that this kind of little uptick in inflation is now being used as an argument for why we need to start tightening the belt, right? That things have gotten too good for working people, that, people are lazy right now because they're getting too many benefits, that the economic consequences of the pandemic have all but, have pretty much been solved, right? That's not true at all. People are seriously struggling. And if what happens out of this is, higher prices for goods, right? And then wages gains that just completely get eradicated in that, we will be in a worse off situation. And to highlight this point of what it's like for most working people in this country right now, and why it's so ridiculous that you're seeing people like Joe Manchin starting to push back against spending initiatives. If you could pull up this SNAP map. Thank you. SNAP is something that's personal to me, right? As the product of that program, that was the program that put food in my belly. This is something I think some people don't have connections with, and they don't realize how damaging these failures are. So this map right here is before they put in a 15% increase as a part of pandemic responses from the federal government, from Congress, right? And what the blue represents are areas where there is a gap between a SNAP benefit and the cost of a meal. And just so people know, when they're talking about a cost of a meal for an individual with these calculations, we're not talking about, Chipotle or something like that. It's around $2.41 a person. Right. This is not luxury. It's cruel already. But if you look at this map, you can see how many people, even with the SNAP benefits, were not able to use those to afford the full price of a meal. Now, this is what happened with the pandemic. They increased that 15%. If you could just click that little button there, you'll see that while a few areas saw some increases, many didn't. In basically covering the gap between SNAP benefits and the increases in the price of a meal. And this is also something when you're reading this map. It's like the same thing when you look at an electoral map. There are parts of the country where a hell of a lot of people live, and there's also lots of parts of the country where there aren't a lot of people. And big parts of the yellow parts of the map are more rural areas. And if you look at those areas too, we're not seeing the huge discrepancies. No one's buying nice stuff with this. Again, we're talking about $2.41 a meal, right? So again, these benefits, if I recall correctly, are set to expire in just a couple of months as well, right? There's been a complete failure in this society to provide for the people. And what we've seen from the Biden administration is, these small little tweaks around the edges, but it's inadequate. It sunsets. And to start talking like we've sort of solved the problem or we're close to it and now it's time for austerity to tighten our belt is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, just this morning I heard the bodega guy explaining the hot food regulation. I mean, if there's like a reason to storm Congress, for instance, it's that just malicious disdain for people, like just demeaning, like no reason for it.
And the evil of it, for people, it depends on where you live, right? But if you grew up in, poor areas like me, when you go into the Walmart, they have, rotisserie chickens, right? And they're hot. But you'll notice they'll have a couple in the fridge section that are cold. But why would you want that? Well, it's because you won't be able to get it if the temperature is too high. I mean, one of the most absurd and demeaning aspects of our system, and that's a whole other conversation about how inefficient our system is in the first place. But we're at a point right now where it's just underfunded.
Right.
And I know we have folks we want to get to, but there's 2 points we wanted to make here. One is just remind people about what's happening for working people. There's another story that should be noted, that we're seeing record levels of dropouts at community college in the United States. And that's a really good indicator. It's a horrifying indicator, but it's an indicator that really shows what's happening with working class members of American society, they're saying that they're unable to basically maintain, the kind of workload that comes with doing coursework and with working full time in the U.S. during the pandemic. We should note, and I know you wanted to note about this too, right? That we really are living in different worlds, and not only just financially, but geographically. It's interesting to see, like, obviously some of the most unequal parts of the country are places like New York City. I mean, you can see that, right? But a hell of a lot of rich folks have absconded up into Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pull this article up here. What I find so fascinating about it, I saw a TikTok a while ago about how rich people are they have like these plane communities where they like fly into town after being, oh come on, Business Insider. Business Insider's giving me an ad block treatment. I gotta get through that. Okay, yeah, here we go. But yeah, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I don't know if I've been into Wyoming. I've seen Devil's Tower, but not this stuff. But yeah, wealthy people are flying to Jackson Hole.
Yeah.
I need to find this TikTok. If you have something to say on this, of these rich people flying in, that I forgot.
No, I mean, it's horrible. I mean, for people who are from Wyoming, what that does is it creates this absurd situation of price inflation. I mean, housing is one of the most extreme examples of this, right? That most working people can't even, buy a home is sort of like, that's antiquated at this point. Most working people, we can't even dream of owning something. And that's becoming a sort of universal aspect of being an American now, right? We've gone from the dream of the white picket fence, every person gets a home kind of idea, to the realization that that's only for rich people. And when you have this kind of influx of billionaires, you get what Matt opened up the segment talking about, these insane luxury markets, right? So they stop building affordable housing for people. People have to leave, parts of the country that they've lived in for generations.
Yeah. I mean, it really is like Peter Thiel's sort of like seasteading fantasies about escaping society. Like before that happens, they are just going to take over some of the most beautiful places in this country with sort of like Elysium neighborhoods that are only accessible by private jet.
No, I mean, it's frightening, and you can really, I mean, this is America really is becoming clearly a class society. And before we go and bring it on Bessner and Davison, I did want to make the point about Manchin and why this kind of austerity religion is so damaging, right? So they're already getting worked up about inflation, right? You're already seeing Biden is starting to retreat on these things and starting to try to make excuses for people who are basically demanding more and more austerity. And then you have the hammer of the Democratic Party, Joe Manchin, right? And Sinema. These folks who, again, it's worth noting, they're the public faces of this opposition, right? But they're shielding their people. They're shielding members of the Democratic Party as they do the will of the super rich in this country.
Joe Biden. I mean, they're definitely shielding
Joe Biden. Yeah.
Joe Biden. You look at the Delaware senators, they're lockstep with Manchin and Sinema. You don't hear about him as much because it draws too close of a line to the guy who's really the impediment, which is Joe Biden.
Yeah, and what Manchin does and what a lot of Republicans do is they hold tight to this rhetoric that makes a lot of damn sense to anyone who has ever managed a family budget, to anyone who's a working person who's had to make those kind of decisions at the end of the week, what you can and cannot afford, right? Which is that when things are tight, you got to buckle up, right? But that is wrong. It's wrong as advice to give to a country. And if you have this clip here, Matt, I think Yanis Varoufakis, the left-wing economist and former member of Syriza, I think really outlines it well here when he gets confronted with this kind of rhetoric when he's doing a question time bit.
Economics is really simple. I've got £10 in my pocket. If I go out and buy 3 pints of beer in Cambridge, I'm probably borrowing money. If I carry on doing that, then I'm going to run out of money and I'm going to go bust. It's not difficult, guys. Just sit down, work out what the country needs to do and work collectively
because the
together.
Country does not operate as your budget does.
We have a budget.
But why not? Why not? Why
In
not?
the country, total expenditure equals total income. in your life, you have a wonderful independence between your expenses and your income. So when you cut down on your expenses, your income doesn't cut. It's not cut. But for the country as a whole, if the country as a whole goes into a major savings spree, then its total income is going to come down. So your personal life is not a good model on which to base the running of the economy.
Yeah, and I think that he puts it really well there, and I think it's a good rhetorical bit too, because like you just have to deal with those simplistic analogies simplistically, right? The fact is that austerity killed. It killed people in this country. It killed people all across the West when this became the dominant mode of governance, right? And what we're seeing from the federal government, both under Trump and Biden, is not austerity. So why is there this push right now to like go back to the old playbook, right? To go back to the budget, the old school budget kind of analogies? Well, it's not because they want to go back to austerity again, right? It's this fear that if the money goes a certain way, that it's going to have fundamental changes to the U.S. economy. What do I mean by that? We opened up this segment with the fact that not only have the rich got richer, this is a world historic transfer of wealth. This is a world historic concentration of wealth in a few people, and you see it in the kind of over the top stuff like the space travel from the Bezos and the Musks, right? But you also see it from all of the luxury markets too that Matt was pointing out, right? There are a lot of people at the top who have too much damn money, and we spent a lot of money trying to make sure that they were taken care of during this crisis. And they did that through making sure that asset prices not only stayed stable during a global pandemic, but that they actually increased in value. They did it through direct cash influxes and a lot of other moves by the federal government and the Federal Reserve that basically operate under a logic that the taps go one way, as Mark Blythe says, right? We don't have a system in this country to pump money into the into the pockets of working people, or at least it's not accepted as political rhetoric, right? And why are people like Manchin and Sinema and the Biden administration secretly trying to shut down this kind of demand for the government to do more to make sure that people are taken care of as this pandemic continues to rage on? It's because they are afraid of a fundamental shift, of a fundamental redistribution of power and money in this society. They want to discipline labor, and they want to get everybody to go back to work, and they want to make sure that you're going back to work, not only for the paltry wage that you were making before the pandemic, but likely for even less. Biden has already shown that he is much too ready to accept these bad faith criticisms from the right and the rich, and we just can't let them get away with it right now.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to take a quick break. Patreon.com/leftreckoning if you want to assist us and get the post games. We had a really great talk with Corey Pine about UFOs and Peter Thiel and stuff like that. So patreon.com/leftreckoning. We will see you in a little bit. All right, folks, we are back. David Griscoe, Matt Leck, joined by the two gentlemen who are the proprietors of the brand new American Prestige podcast. We have Derek Davison. He's himself the steward of the Foreign Exchanges Substack, which is an insane value proposition as far as Substacks go. And we also have Daniel Bessner, who is the author of Democracy in Exile, Hans Speyer and the Rise of the Defense Intellectual. Memorize that before the show. Welcome to the Left Reckoning, both of you. It's I'm very happy to have you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, well, we got a lot of stuff to get to, so why don't we just jump into it? I wanted to start with Afghanistan, just because for me, I feel like this is like the third or fourth time in my life that the United States has left. And I was just wondering if for somebody who might have just seen the headlines, hasn't really been following what's been going on, if maybe Derek could sort of take us through just generally what's going on with the U.S. Occupation of Afghanistan or the history.
Yeah, it's in theory, it's almost over. Joe Biden has said we'll be out by the end of August. The Taliban has been on a rampage the last several days. They've captured 9, I think at this point, provincial capitals. The latest U.S. intelligence assessment suggests that they could take Kabul in about 90 days if they set their minds to it. That's down from 6 months. Just I think in June was the last time they did an assessment. I may be wrong about that. But that's, cutting it in half in just a very short amount of time. They control about 65% of the country at this point. They are, as I said, they've captured 9 provincial capitals. They're threatening at least 2 more, Kandahar and Lashkar Gah in the south. But they've taken all of northeastern Afghanistan at this point, and they are a couple of provinces away from controlling the entire northern region of the country. And that includes one of the biggest cities in Afghanistan, Mazar-e-Sharif, which is a major commercial hub and is surrounded now. It's the capital of Balkh province and is entirely surrounded by Taliban-controlled territory. It's cut off from the rest of the country.
Now, on the first episode of American Prestige, you're talking with Stephen Wertheim, or maybe this was before Stephen got on, but there was you addressed the notion that the military basically botched the pullout to make it as poorly as possible. And like the question to me is like, first of all, what do they think they're proving? But I'm just curious, like, how is that hypothesis played out? And like, I guess, what does it tell us about the military's mindset in these sorts of situations?
It's really good.
Yeah,
oh, sorry.
I want to say that's a hypothesis. That's not like there's no evidence that the military is deliberately botching this. It's based on the fact that the withdrawal has been very haphazard. It's not been well organized, and they had quite a bit of time to sort of know that this was coming after Donald Trump negotiated, his administration negotiated a withdrawal agreement with the Taliban that was supposed to take effect, in the spring, and Biden extended that deadline. So the military has seen this coming for a while, and if this is sort of the best organized withdrawal that they could manage, it's not very impressive.
Right.
Yeah, and I also think it's interesting to just look more generally at the military. I think the military in American history, and I think this has been largely true for the last 20 or so years since 9/11, generally is not since 9/11, sorry, since World War II. Generally, the military has been reticent to get into conflict. But once it is in conflict, it is reticent to leave. So I think you're seeing a lot of, tantrums might be too strong a word, but something along those lines through the withdrawal. That a lot of military leaders, probably to some degree at least, think if they were either given more resources or given better resources or given smarter resources, would have been able to complete the mission. So that has been true throughout American history. Once the military is there, they're less willing to leave, and I think that's probably what's going on a little bit now.
Also, can you tell us about Max Boot and the whole Indian War hypothesis and sort of what that reveals? And like, who is he speaking for there? How like prevalent is just the guys who want that but know that you can't just say that?
It's hard to know who he's really speaking for. I mean, I'm sure there's some like very ghoulish people in DC who really believe in things like that. And ghoulish, I literally mean in the technical sense, sort of picking over the bones of the dead, which is what the term originally meant. But what he's trying to get at is that it's this sort of Cold War era idea that the conquest of the American continent was a secularizing and democratizing project, and that even though it involved native displacement and native genocide, it was ultimately worth it because you're pushing the history toward progress. And I think that is essentially what he's doing there as well. He's saying that this is a new frontier. It's the United States secularization project in a different scale, just working in Afghanistan. And so just like it took hundreds of years to quote unquote subdue or secularize the Indians again, and that's the language he used the language of Indian war. It's not the language I would use, but that this is something that needs to be done in Afghanistan. And I think that it's also, again, showing these strong currents in American history of like basically taking non-white lives as seriously as one takes white lives. It's just a very, from inherently a racialized project, and that American bombs are much more are much more used on non-white populations than they are on white populations. And I think it's just an extension of that longer racialized logic of genocide and imperialism that has defined the American project from the beginning.
Yeah, you make the point that isolationism is really just don't fuck with other European powers, and you keep it in your backyard.
Exactly.
Well, on that tradition, I don't know if you have it handy, Matt, this Dan Crenshaw bit, I really think does highlight it. Because, I mean, we're 2 decades in it now, and what has been the results of it? Dan Crenshaw sort of lays out his view. I'd be curious to hear what y'all think.
This is for the Young Americans for Liberty.
Jesus Christ.
Young Americans for Freedom, maybe. I don't know. Whatever.
I think Americans are pretty sick of nation building. But the general public can't really distinguish between 200,000 troops and nation building, which does seem like a waste of money to a lot of people and a lot of waste of resources. But they can't distinguish between that and keeping a security presence that prevents another 9/11. People ask all the time, well, what do we get through the last 20 years of war? No more 9/11s. That's what we got. That's a pretty good deal. And guys like me are not victims. We're hungry to get out there and kill some bad guys. And it's just what we do. And I wish they weren't there. I wish they didn't wake up every morning and try to plan attacks on the homeland. But that is what they'll do when they have the operational space and the timing and just the comfort level to do so. Afghanistan is quickly going to fall into a pre-9/11 kind of situation, very, very quickly. Now, I don't know what they're going to do with all that freedom. I don't think they're going to build a really nice, happy civilization. I don't think they're going to let women go to school. I think they're going to hang people in the soccer fields and murder people. I think that's probably what they're going to end up doing. And they're going to create a kind of a home base for a lot of terrorists.
I mean, we went a good, 225 years without a 9/11. So going 20 years without a 9/11 doesn't strike me as all that impressive, to be completely honest. I mean, that's just, it is a very good example of the kind of infantile discussion that you get about foreign policy with a lot of people, especially I think in Congress, where the default is to talk about good guys and bad guys, and we're like the Avengers in the movies, and we're gonna go in there and protect and defend everything, and it doesn't touch on the reality of these conflicts and the interminable pressure that we have put on the Afghan people and what we've done there for 20 years. Not nation building, by the way. If we had been nation building successfully, they would have a nation that could withstand the Taliban by now, but it's been 20 years and they don't. That was very indicative of sort of the level of discourse that you get, I think.
And it's interesting because Crenshaw is actually a veteran of the Afghanistan wars. And I think he was the IED that hit him in Afghanistan? It must have been. So he actually lost his eye over this conflict, and it's just an incredible example of ideology to be someone who, or it's just pure cynicism, which is always possible as well. And then that frankly struck me more as pure cynicism than believing in anything. But even if it's pure cynicism, to like have personally suffered for this pointless, and I think it's really, it's fair to say, and you know, you just got to be honest about it. These pointless wars is really, you know, it makes you question what we're all doing here to a certain degree, that level of ideological commitment to such a failed project.
It always bugs me when Crenshaw seems conscious of, like, he always says, I'm not a victim, whether it's being made fun of by SNL or in this thing. But like the honestly, the iconography of you is that people see you're a victim of this and actually supporting it, right? Like that's the main value that he brings to this, is he's clearly wounded warrior, that sort of thing, and then can say exactly what, you know, who is he representing in the military, Crenshaw? Like what is it like Blackwater, or like what kind of what do you think is going on there?
I think he thinks he represents the average American idiot, and like literally, because I think he's
such a silver spoon boy. I'm sorry, not to cut you off, but he's just like, he's a rich kid through and through. So it's exhausting to hear guys like that go on. I believe he grew up in Switzerland or something like that too. Like, you know what I mean? It doesn't get as un-average American as that.
He's contemptuous of his public, I think, ultimately. I think he's extremely cynical and extremely contemptuous just as a person and as a politician. That's what strikes me most about him always.
Right. Well, I don't know how anybody can take him seriously after that batshit commercial he did for the Georgia special election. That was the dumbest thing I have ever seen. And how it did not destroy this man's credibility is astounding.
You know, and I don't think, like, he's done a couple of commercials like that too. That wasn't,
has he really? That wasn't the only one.
I have to find it, but he's done some for himself like that as well. Right. And I think that goes right to Danny's point too, that he might just be cynical and he has contempt and he thinks everyone is just an idiot. But I don't know. He might. I think there's a bit of truth in his idiocy there. But I did want to make the point here about Crenshaw, because he's often like touted as this kind of new figure of the right? Oh, like, you know, he's the young face of the Republican Party and he represents this kind of shift within the Republican Party. But I don't really see too much ideological development from Crenshaw to what we were seeing when we were first jumping into the war. And I will say I was very young when all that was happening. So I would be curious to hear what y'all think about that. Like I feel like there's a straight line to Crenshaw from Bush.
Yeah, I mean, all these guys, Crenshaw, Tom Cotton, I mean, it's pure sort of Bush era neoconservatism that they're desperately trying to fit into a party that has been sort of changed by Donald Trump's nativism. But even Trump's foreign policy wasn't a divergence. It was just, was mostly more of the same, maybe a little more kind of overt about some of the things that we try not to talk about openly, or that other administrations try not to talk about openly. But there was no real effort to pull back or reduce America's military footprint. The Pentagon budget shot up. We bombed, the same places we were always bombing. And it's a misapprehension, I think, of what Trump was about, and sort of this kind of desire to appeal to his base, which I don't know if they really care that much when we blow up Somalia or Afghanistan. I just don't think it's that big a deal for them, but clearly it's, kind of gripped the neocons.
Yeah, I think Derek's exactly right. I think it was Sam Moyn who said Trump's foreign policy was just Bush's and Obama's foreign policy, but more, particularly Obama's foreign policy, because he didn't get any hot wars. But I think that's genuinely accurate and generally accurate. And I think that what we have, and what Derek also gestured toward, is we have what I've been calling the demasification of war, right? War doesn't affect most Americans, and that's by design. One, most Americans don't literally affect it in terms of the political decisions that go into it. You have essentially an administrative shadow state organized ever increasingly, not even in the State Department, but in the literal White House. So ordinary Americans don't affect what the nation does abroad. And then you also have the fact that, we have an all-volunteer force, and basically we've started fighting our wars with mercenaries and drones and special forces. So it doesn't really affect the ordinary American's daily life. And so you have this situation where the United States could kind of just, trundle along indefinitely, just doing what it does. It's pretty grim for most of the world's peoples.
Yeah, and I think you wrote a good piece in Foreign Exchanges about the unknowns of empire that I do think really hit at this tension that we're seeing, because in the piece you make the point, and as Dan Crenshaw does as well, people are no longer selling these things as nation building or humanitarian interventions. Yet the empire does continue to sort of march along. At least rhetorically within the Republican Party, and now in a lot of other arenas with the Biden administration. And that while there's been a kind of shift with the the Republicans and Trumpism, I think you've used the word for the Biden, like the foreign policy experts in the Biden administration is sort of like on autopilot, like they're sort of lost as an ideological movement. How would you sort of like categorize the movement of the people who are really influencing the Biden policy and the kind of centrist wing of the foreign policy groupings?
Well, I think they're pursuing a strategy of hegemonic stabilization. I've said this in a few different places. We've talked about it on the podcast, and the sense that they understand the United States is either like not 1945, controlling 50% of world production. It's not 1991, where they're the only superpower. Mm-hmm. So they understand that it's never going to be able to dominate the world like it does. And I think there's probably a growing realization, slowly but surely. It's not like these people are the most necessarily thoughtful or have the most foresight, but I think there's a growing recognition that the U.S. won't fight World War III over Japan or South Korea or Taiwan. And so there's a growing recognition that at some point in the future, I think people probably think between 25 and 50 years, I probably say between 10 and 15 years, the United States won't be able to be the sole hegemon in East Asia. I think that's probably unrealistic. I think Hong Kong was part of like a gambit on that behalf of the CCP to see what would happen. And what happened? Nothing. Just like when Putin invaded Georgia and then Ukraine, what happened? Nothing, because the United States isn't going to fight World War III over these things. It's just not going to happen. So I think that there's a recognition that the power relationships are changing. But again, I think that what Derek was pointing toward is absolutely correct, that the structures, the bases are mostly going to remain the same. And I think what's interesting is I'm not sure if someone like Samantha Power believes in like the utopic vision of humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect, because it's just not possible. And I think you saw it in the fact that I think about a week ago, South Sudan, Derek, correct me if I'm wrong, joined the ICC, and Samantha Power had this extremely obnoxious tweet like, could you believe Sudan joined the ICC? Yes, the Sudan joined the ICC, and Ilhan Omar retweeted, like maybe one day the United States, yes, the United States will join the ICC, right? And that's just not something that would have happened 10 years ago, right? So like even within the Democratic Party, you have people just essentially pointing to facts and being like, this is just total bullshit. So there's no utopia anymore. And so without a utopia, I'm not sure that an ideology could survive. And liberalism just certainly, what's their utopia? Climate change, but a little slower. I mean, like it's an ideology without a core, and I think something is going to replace it. What that is, I have no idea, but that's where we are. At least that's how I view it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the liberal heyday of the 90s kind of transitioned into the war on terror, and we've come out of that really without an organizing principle, or scrambling to find a new organizing principle. There is this push, although, Danny, as you say, there's a realization that the United States isn't going to fight a war with China, but there is this push to create a new Cold War with China, which is an impossibility, I think, because you're not talking about two fundamentally different and separate systems of economics and governance. You're talking about two countries whose economies are totally intertwined with one another, practicing some form of capitalism on some level. I just don't think it's possible to kind of sustain the level of opposition and separation that the Cold War involved. And it's all kind of, it's just silly to me. I mean, you talk about what, is the United States going to be able to maintain hegemony in East Asia in 50 years? In 50 years, the South Pacific is going to be underwater, and we're going to have a lot of other problems to deal with. Like, who cares? And to some extent, it's a failure of imagination, I think, or maybe a failure of what's possible, to not see that the big issues coming up are things that we need to organize everybody around. We need to organize around a really long shot ditch to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We need to worry about pandemics. We need to worry about these kinds of things. And there's just no kind of appetite for that, it seems like.
And the grim thing is, and I don't know what you guys think, I'll throw it back to you on your own podcast. But the grim thing is, I don't see another sort of transnational consciousness available. And that's the scary part, right? I don't think there's like a transnational working class consciousness waiting to be activated. So I don't know what comes next. And also it was Sudan that joined the ICC, not South Sudan. So correcting myself. But yeah, curious what you guys think about that.
Well, I mean, I feel like that leads kind of into the next topic I wanted to bring up, which is, well, do you want to say something first, David, on that?
Well, no, I think I know where you're going. So I will say that, for me, the only real, I mean, not only, but the most encouraging moments that we're seeing right now are coming in South America. And in there, it's interesting though, from I would imagine from a historical perspective, to see the United States and China, if they are these are the two superpowers sort of battling it out, the way that they're interacting with countries like Peru, for example, right, is the Chinese are playing a very different game than the Americans have been. When there was a lot of worries, for example, that the U.S. State Department was going to do another kind of Bolivia move in Peru when the election was close, and they sort of backed off. Meanwhile, China has been very, very open to that part of the world, but not always necessarily in a just purely uninterested way, right? They get a lot from that part of the world too. So I agree, though. I mean, at the same time, we're talking about a few countries that have some left-wing populist movements. That's not the grand horizon of global world communism. It is a weird political moment to sort of figure ourselves on an international scale.
Yeah, I guess I kind of want to move the same kind of energy into this about hegemonic stabilization and where anti-democracy sort of fits into that. And we'll play some clowns on Bannon and Mike Lindell here, but I'm also curious. Danny, I enjoyed your conversation on Ben Burgess's show with the Know Your Enemy guys, and I think the one takeaway that I basically agree with is far more concerning to me than people who would take Stop the Steal seriously enough to go demonstrate at the Capitol is that you have major right-wing parties who are just lying about elections and doing all blatantly telegraphing lawfare or legislative type coups. So I want to put I also want to say this sort of international fascist apparatus here, and maybe Danny, you want to take issue with that term, but is developing. But I just want to start off with the way Mike Lindell tries to pronounce Bolsonaro's last name here, because it's got the fluency isn't quite there. So
he's just a pure American. I love it.
Here's clip one.
We have the president's son, Eduardo, coming here. If I say it right, how do you say it? Bolsonaro. Yeah.
Bolsonaro.
Okay, Bolsonaro. He's going to be coming here to speak in a couple hours, but there are the same things going on in their country. Okay? But
and I want to cut quickly to the Bannon one here. Where they talk about
Bobo Faro,
Eduardo,
Bobro.
He really thought he could get away with just saying Eduardo.
It's just not in the United States.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's what I did when I was in middle school. I had to write a paper on Thor Heyerdahl, and I didn't know how to say it, so I just referred to him as Thor.
Thor, I remember.
Says, "Are you friends with him? What are you doing?" And I like when Mike Lindell does that. Sorry to interrupt, guys.
It's right, Steve?
Well, next October, remember, about 30 days before this monumental midterm election, he's going to face, his father, Jair Bolsonaro, is going to face the most dangerous leftist in the world, Lula, a criminal, a communist, and supported by all the media here in the United States, all the left-wing media. This election is the second most important election in the world, right? In the most important elections ever in South America. Bolsonaro will win unless it's stolen by, guess what? The machines.
The machines.
Okay, so
Like Terminator, like the machine, the rise of the machines,
Voting machines, right?
leftist candidates. Yeah.
I mean, I just wanted to note real quick that I do love like Mike Lindell, who just is such an American in the sense that they have no conception of the rest of the world unless you can compare it to America. And we've been making the point, it's like, right, it's like, so they only understand right-wing, left-wing politics in other countries. It's like, oh, they're going to try to steal like they did against Trump, which again, they didn't for the YouTube moderators. And two, it's the same thing with like COVID, right? It's like the right wing just like talks about all these like hypotheticals. If you do this, this or that, then this is going to happen. And then you have an entire globe, which is, sort of experimented with all the different types of way of dealing with the pandemic. And they just very, traditional kind of American just blindness to the rest of the world. It's amazing to see.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, it's red meat. I mean, what faction of the Trump coalition actually cares about Brazil? Like, what percentage do they actually care? But if you can create this kind of global communist menace that's somehow coming for all of us, then it helps them domestically. It helps to whip up the rubes.
Yeah, I'm curious what you guys think. Just like globally, democracy. Like I was very influenced by Ira Katznelson's Fear Itself as one of like the first audiobooks I ever bought, and it's basically like the 30s and 40s foreclosure of democracy and like authoritarianism. And this is an area you know a lot about, Daniel. I'm curious, like we don't just see this from right-wing parties like in Peru or in Bolivia, right? You see this coming from centrists increasingly, not only internationally but like against India Walton and Buffalo. Like it seems like it's not looking great for like voting in this planet.
Voting, like just literally voting. Yeah. I mean, if you think about the last century as being about a process of defining down what democracy means, social democracy and economic democracy, and even sometimes a little bit cultural democracy, over the course, and Katznelson kind of gestures toward this, over the course of the 30s and the 40s, and the 50s, democracy gets defined down as voting, right? You get to choose which elite governs you, right? You're not going to have a say in a lot of the major decisions that the administrative state is going to govern through, through rules which aren't approved by anyone democratically elected, through norms which aren't even rules, they're just kind of in the ether. So you're not going to have a say, ordinary person who's American, but you'll get to choose which like elite kind of like sets up the chessboard. We're getting rid of that now, and it's just like, this is what I mean by when I say we're living in an era of demassified politics. We could talk about it, Derek and I often do, with relation to the security, the military apparatus, but it's basically true in all spheres of our politics. Ordinary people don't have much of a say, not even through the vote, where you're kind of choosing between, like, I think a lot of both sides share certain assumptions about capitalism and imperialism. But you're even something like a mass protest like the George Floyd protests, they don't really do anything. And if you look at, Biden, just, police have not been defunded, nor they have been abolished. And if anything, they have actually received more resources from the state. So that, I mean, whether or not we like it, that indicates something about how power works in the society at this moment. And what it indicates to me, and I'm developing this idea more in writing, but what it indicates to me is that we live in an era where we have the structure of mass politics, large political parties, Twitter, mass exchange. We have the ideology of mass politics, and we have the assumptions of mass politics without the power of mass politics. So I think we're living in a kind of a strange moment where, like, everyone has a voice, and in actuality, no one has a voice. Everyone could go on the streets, but that doesn't really going to do anything. So again, it's not a great situation.
Yeah, I mean, for sure with that. And It's been a weird past few years because I mean maybe just because of what I've been paying attention to see how effective American discourse is in other countries, like this voting stuff, right? That Bannon's proposing in Brazil. I mean, this is Trump's playbook, and they tried to do the exact same thing in Peru. The cynic in me. And Matt and I were saying this on the show is that it didn't really work that effectively in Peru, even though the margins were really, really tight in that election. And I think it's because Trump sort of like spoiled the game with the calling fraud after an election, right? Because the American like liberal media is just immediately going to be against that, right? If you could say, oh, this is a Trumpist thing, then it might not be that effective. But it is interesting to see that this is the kind of avenue that so much right-wing politics is going into, Danny, that like is actually like it's a populist denial of democracy in that sense, right? It's like the democracy is only like what's in your heart, right? And your guy truly won, and the machines are the one that stopped him from winning.
And just very briefly, and I'll let Derek talk. I mean, David, you're in your heart. It's related to Christianity as well, right? The particular form that evangelical Christianity has taken over since the 1970s is this very individualistic association with like Jesus Christ on a one-to-one level, as many scholars have shown. And so you're finding its expressions in different realms, including politics.
And God selected all of the people to break through this, Mike Lindell, by giving him the scripture in the form of the packets.
Right. Which is Calvinism, right? Which is just updated Calvinism. Mike Lindell is the ultimate Calvinist in a real way.
I would just say, to go back to your analogy, I wouldn't draw any conclusions from what happened in Peru that you could apply to, say, Brazil. Mm-hmm. Keiko Fujimori had a lot of baggage that was very specific to her and her father. I question whether Castillo could have won a head-to-head race against any other candidate, frankly, given that the margin was so narrow and that she was really, I mean, surprising. It's surprising that she finished second. She was, such a kind of loaded candidate. I think, Bolsonaro is definitely playing. He's definitely reading out of the Trump playbook. Mm-hmm. But he does have some things in his favor. He's got a military that may be a little friendlier to the idea of intervening politically on his behalf than the U.S. military was of the idea of intervening on Trump's behalf. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't have the same kind of like history to him that Fujimori does that made her kind of situation in Peru a little unique.
Yeah, that Brazil stuff about how readily people will just say, yeah, we should put the generals back in charge. Like, that's a bit of a culture shock to me still.
I mean, that was Bolsonaro's campaign pitch to some degree. Like, we should put the generals back in charge, and he won. And he has. He's put, he's got generals all over the place in that government.
I would just note on this too. Our friend Brian Muir at Brazil Wire made a point recently. I know we didn't select it to do this week, but people probably saw on Twitter the videos of Bolsonaro's very kind of underwhelming military parade that he did over the weekend, right? And it's great, it's very funny to laugh at him. But Brian did sort of, sometimes you have to remember the context of these things too. He's like, it's not that funny in a country that has had military dictatorship that somebody is playing around like this. We should take
it wasn't meant to make a public spectacle. It was meant to have military units marching past the Congress building saying, exactly, do what I want here, or else there could be some problems.
Exactly. And I think we shouldn't ignore that. But I would be curious what you all think about this, just because, we talk about Mike Lindell because obviously he's the most fun one there. But Bannon, he's interesting the way that he talks in those moments. Because I was saying to Matt before we went live, it's like when I hear Bannon start to talk about like a right-wing international and all this kind of stuff, there's a part of me that gets really, really nervous, right? Because he's like, sometimes seems like he's almost talking like a good socialists in the early 20th century, like there is some kind of organized movement of right wingers, right? But then I have to remind myself that Bannon really is a showman, and his whole shtick has been presenting a movement that might have not really been there. I mean, we're post-Trump now. How strong do you think that thesis was that there was this kind of right-wing populist movement even under Trump? And how would you categorize it now?
It's a very interesting question because I think it's an incredibly complex question, because I think what American conservatives have done have embraced the language of identity politics to basically, advocate a sort of like white reactionary populist challenge. And I think that is something that clearly exists. Now, to what degree that's more than racialized reaction and represents some sort of economic, populist reaction in the sense that like the farm populists did in the 1890s, it's tough to know, because it does seem to me, and you guys might be updated on these statistics, that the general member of this sort of reaction and the general Trump voter is actually of a higher economic class, right? So if anything, it's not quite populist, at least in the sense that the term is, populism has never been really used to mean like bourgeois reaction. It seems more like a bourgeois reaction than anything. For sure. Right? Like a sort of petit bourgeois or just flat out bourgeois reaction, and sort of, it's the liberals have their proletarianizing, PMC, and then the right has its proletarianizing, small business person. And that's what it seems like more to me than genuinely populist. It seems like when you're thinking about populism, those people, who the Bernie campaign was supposed to activate, just like are so alienated from politics that they're not even like a political form. They're like a miasma that exists. Now, granted, American presidential elections, at least, have never had great voter turnouts. I think like in the 1960 election versus Kennedy and Nixon was also about 60% turnout, if I recall correctly. So to what degree is that a change? Very tough to know.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder. I mean, like Bannon specifically has connections in Brazil with Bolsonaro's family and that whole campaign. And it was very funny to see when Trump was in office, and this, rest in peace to Trump's Twitter, he was constantly following and unfollowing Bolsonaro. Whenever Bolsonaro would do anything embarrassing, Trump would unfollow him and then follow him back from time to time. It's going to, I mean, I guess it's one of those things we're just going to have to watch to see if Bannon's able to sort of reignite himself as this kind of international whisperer of right-wing.
Yeah, I mean,
movements.
Mike Lindell's cybersecurity conference in Sioux Falls, South Dakota is not exactly like the like Eagle's Nest.
But it's like, but the thing is, like, they would never be talking about Bolsonaro if Bannon wasn't there in the first place. Yeah. And that's the truth.
Well, and we don't, I mean, the pandemic kind of intervened here, right? I mean, there was this movement, there were governments in Europe, there were, governments all over the place that were sort of supposed to be part of this right-wing global movement. And I mean, you have to really kind of struggle to think of any of them that managed the pandemic well, that didn't pay some political price. Bolsonaro's approval ratings are in the tank largely because he, botched the pandemic. Benjamin Netanyahu suffered from the pandemic in Israel and now is not prime minister anymore. The approval ratings for people like, the darling of the right, Viktor Orban, or, you look at Turkey, where Recep Tayyip Erdogan is also struggling a little bit with people angry now. There's a lot of people are upset about, but they were, upset about his pandemic management. So we kind of hit the.
Oops, looks like we might be losing.
The show that while these guys can talk,
Derek, you're back.
You're back.
I'm back. Okay.
I think he's about to announce Benjamin Netanyahu will be third mic on American Prestige. We were going to save that, but that's a big one.
I could only help Oris.
It's the machines.
No, I just think we hit this kind of unpredictable event that demonstrated that a lot of these people can talk a decent game. They talk, blame migrants, blame this, blame that, raise the specter of communism, but they can't actually govern.
Right.
When push comes to shove, like they really struggle to govern. And so, you have to account for that kind of affecting the momentum of that wave.
And just what Derek says, that it's kind of what COVID's revealed, across regime type. It's that like it's a lot. There's clearly a crisis of governmental capacity and just clearly governance capacity. That is a huge, huge problem. That I was talking with my friend the other day, and he's like, it feels like something's about to pop off. And I agree, but it kind of feels like something's been about to pop off for a decade. And I'm just wondering how long this is going to last, because like these crises of governance, these crises of ideology, these crises of basically everything lead one to conclude that something's got to change, and maybe it's just Chairman Xi moving the dialectic forward by adopting state capitalism. I don't know, but it seems like something's got to change in the sort of North Atlantic world.
Yeah, it's not, and that's not adding Brazil to NATO.
I think Brazil should be added to NATO. We're a pro-NATO podcast. We think actually every country in the world should.
If every country was in NATO, I mean, the world would be a better place.
I think that's American prestige guarantee. NATO everywhere.
Well, let's this last couple minutes, I want to make sure that people know about American Prestige. It's a podcast that I subscribe to immediately. I have not been disappointed from both the public episodes, but also the great bonus episodes. Could y'all just sort of give people a little flavor of what American Prestige is?
Well, Derek and I have been talking for a year that the podcast space needs more white guys gabbing. So that's first and
foremost. We just need more podcasts. Like, where are the podcasts? Not enough.
So we figure we do our part. Representation matters. No, but in all seriousness, we do believe that there's lack of foreign policy discussion broadly on the left. I mean, there are some certain podcasts that do it, but the major podcasts come from a very liberal centrist or even right-wing perspective. So essentially what we're trying to do is to make, foreign policy and international affairs fun for the kids, but to give people a sense that, if they come to our podcast once a week, they'll get a sense of what's going on in the world. What are the major things that's kind of like difficult to keep track of. And I really, if people want more on that, they should definitely subscribe to Derek's Foreign Exchanges newsletter, by far the best source on international affairs out there. It's really great. Obviously subscribe, pay money, but the free version is also great. But, to give people a sense of what's going on, and each week we're probably going to have an interview with an expert as well on a particular topic related to international affairs, but also, digging deeper into, cultural issues like what is Islam, how does that relate to Christianity, things along those lines. So I think that's what people can come to our podcast for. And then we're going to also have bonus episodes. We've committed to monthly episodes, and hopefully we'll be able to do a bit more that examine sort of the culture of American militarism. Our first bonus episode that David was mentioning was an analysis and commentary with Will Menaker and Matt Christman from Chapo Trap House on the 1990 movie Three Kings. And we'll have, future episodes doing those sorts of analyses of imperialist and militarist culture as well.
Yeah, I think the next one, you said the next one's going to be on video games, right?
Yes, and well, the next one's going to be on video games or another movie, but one of the two, depending on who comes first. But
it's not always going to be movies, but that'll be main focus.
Within the next one or two, we're going to examine video games and how video games portray American empire and things along those lines. So it's not just going to be movies; it's going to be like culture writ large.
Yeah, I think we haven't really. I mean, we've only been doing this will be our 6th week, so we haven't really stretched into some of the areas that I think we can dig into, like religion and some of these topics that are related to foreign policy, but don't always get talked about in that way. So I'm excited to kind of get further into this and kind of stretch out and talk about some bigger topics.
I'm excited to be listening to it, and people can subscribe on Patreon, and most importantly, and they can also find Apple Podcasts and all the other places, correct?
Yes.
We'll definitely go and do that. And Derek and Danny, I'm very, very happy to have you on the show together, and I'd love to do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks
for having us, guys. Take it easy.
All right, we'll be right back, folks, with more Left Reckoning after we say goodbye privately. We're back. Love those guys.
Yeah, good folk.
So we talked earlier about Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro, Eduardo's dad. We talked about Eduardo's dad and how he's basically saying, we're going to try to steal the election. Lula's winning. We should have mentioned Lula's winning in polls by like something like 50 to 25%. Probably going to win in the first round if there's not a military coup. But it's not just the right. And I said anti-left parties sort of foreclosing on democracy and putting their fingers on the scales. We have a situation in Buffalo, David, that you're going to enlighten us about.
Yeah, we have a situation in Buffalo and also in Seattle that we want to highlight, which are examples of a couple of things. One, that centrists and liberals would never, ever try to do something like this to knock out a Republican. They are more deathly afraid of socialists coming into power and actually being able to deliver things for people than they are of the right wing. And this is a horrific example of it in Buffalo. And I wanted to note this. People are probably familiar. India Walton, Democratic Socialist, wins a historical election in the Democratic primary in Buffalo, right? And that's one of those areas where you win the Democratic primary and you're very likely to be the candidate. Well, despite that historic victory and the voters' will being very clear, the city council there is actually trying to undermine her. If you could just scroll down a little bit, this is a piece in Truth Out. Democratic Socialist India Walton's groundbreaking victory in the mayoral primary of Buffalo, New York, was destined to earn the ire of the local powers that be. Longtime Democratic fixture and top ally of Governor Andrew Cuomo, now disgraced, Mayor Brian Brown, was caught off guard and ousted in a startling upheaval, and Walton will now run unopposed by any Republican candidate in November. Walton's win is enormously disruptive to entrenched power, leaving the business community and the political establishment around with their hair on fire, as Jeff Kelly vividly put in The Nation. Walton's social democratic agenda includes police accountability, affordable housing, public banking of particular note in a city marred by the legacy of industrial manufacturing, a climate action plan. Her plan will likely meet significant resistance from not only reactionary conservative unions, police, and capital, but also from her former opponent in the primary. And as some developments indicate, the same Democratic power brokers who have outwardly pledged Walton their support. And it goes on to state that there's basically a full-on campaign right now to eradicate the position of mayor in the city of Buffalo. Which is just a very clear slap in the face to the voters. This is not about promoting democracy. This is not about promoting efficiency. This is about trying to pull the election away from somebody who won fair and square against the entrenched political class that is now trying to use their power to undermine her.
Yeah, and so like running the guy she beat in the primary, trying to run on the ballot, but also there's these things that look a lot like what sort of like I think the North Carolina Republican Party started doing after a Democrat won the governor, which is just remove powers from the office that they won.
Essentially, that's what they're trying to do, is to strip the mayoral position into a position that is essentially, symbolic.
Right. And it's done so in this very I'm trying to see if I can find it here, but basically it's saying that the mayor system, it's now time to dispense with it because it led to underinvestment in certain communities. India Walton, we shouldn't have to say this, as a socialist, ran on investing in those communities, right? Like the idea that you would, now let's do it after all this time. It's a completely cynical use of those sorts of issues.
And not just ran in the class focused kind of way, but a class rooted way. India Walton should be known as a black woman, a working class member of her community, and that's why she was able to get out the vote to defeat this machine in the first place, right? So any of that kind of talk is extremely cynical, but that's a good point, Matt, because not only is this a kind of general attack on democracy itself, but this is the really cynical way that those in power have been trying to use, discourses that have developed to try to fight for acknowledgement and liberation for people, to try to undermine the very forces of power sharing that are needed if you are very serious about serving, marginalized communities, et cetera, as they would say.
Yeah, here's what the council member said. Why justify the inquiry? This is an inquiry into, getting rid of certain powers from the mayor and devolving them onto the council. Justified the inquiry on the grounds that the mayoralty system had resulted in disinvestment in poor neighborhoods. That rationale is particularly incoherent given that the presumptive mayor, whom Wyatt pointedly neglected to mention, is a socialist whose platform includes specific promises to increase investment in poor areas. Yeah, I mean, utterly despicable. And again, there's no difference to me what these sort of centrist Democrats do and what Republicans do. And we know this from the centrist newspaper of record, the New York Times. If you look, there's an article that says that actually the most anti-democratic group of people is the centrists.
Yeah.
And look, the advantage is that she's going to win. She'll be in power and she will have the ability to, to use that office before they are able to even bring something like that to a ballot. To be able to strip her of those powers. So she'll be able to do what socialists do, which is govern effectively. And it's one of those things that, working class politicians tend to stay in office for a very long time because they actually deliver for their people.
One more note, just infuriated me, was the way that the local press is laundering attacks from, say, like landlords that are completely unsubstantiated about India Walton and implying sort of like criminality and stuff like that. Just what's happening in Buffalo is completely despicable, and India Walton needs people's support.
Yes, and keep your eyes on it. And another thing that I want people to keep their eyes on, and I'll put it in the show notes. I didn't have it up with me, but there are ways to continue to support this campaign, is Shama Sawant, who's been showing a different way of doing politics and has been extremely effective at not only delivering for people, but helping us imagine what politics can be when socialists are in power, right? So not just doing the traditional things that people in office do, right, which is like proposing legislation, voting on things like that, but actually using the position as a center for working class organizing, which Shama Sawant has done with her socialist city council office. And a really cynical group, and this is not the first time she's been up against this, but another really cynical group is out there trying to get a recall campaign against Sawant. So remember, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but when she goes up in an election cycle, she is underwater with outside money, basically trying to undermine her time and time again. The sources of the money are very clearly entrenched local business elites, and most notably people like Jeff Bezos, who has been against Shama Sawant from the get-go. And again, this is why Shama Sawant and this movement has been so inspiring. That a city councilor is giving somebody like Bezos so much grief shows what working class politics can really do. And there's been a recall campaign against her. And they've been out collecting signatures for a while, not always through the most transparent means, but they're basically trying to undermine her. So they can't beat her at the ballot box, right? They can't beat her in the elections. So they're trying to get a second recall election where they can just, get a bunch of white suburban wine moms, local business elites worked up about this very scary socialist in the neighborhood, right? But Shama Sawant has done something. If you pull up this Jacobin article, that I just love the guts of this, but I think it really exposes what this campaign is. I mean, this is a piece that was in Jacobin a couple of weeks ago by Shama Sawant, why I signed the petition for my own recall. And this piece, people should give it a read because she sort of goes through what has happened while she's been in office. But I don't need to read from, you can just pull it down. She's shown what they've done in office, but basically exposes the strategy of the recall campaign. And the strategy, just like they've done in cities like Austin and cities all across the country, is these right-wing funded movements. Their biggest fear is going up in a populated election, right? An election where a lot of people show up to vote. They much prefer to vote in, out of season, off year elections, where the electorate is whiter and wealthier. And more conservative. So they've been pushing this recall campaign against her. They have to get so many signatures. And Shama Sawant and her team noticed that they had really slowed down in their collection of signatures recently. And that was because a filing deadline was coming. And if they were to get to turn in those signatures now, that would mean that the election would be held this November. Instead, what they're trying to do is they're trying to, basically slow down their collection of signatures so that they can say, oh, we weren't able to get them in time, blah, blah, and then turn them in so that they can have the election this next summer, where again, the electorate will be more conservative and wealthier than a typical, general election. So what Shama Sawant and her team did was they signed the petition themselves, and they sent out their people all across the city to get people to sign signatures and to sign the recall election against Shama Sawant. And it should be noted too, they collected an incredible amount of signatures, which should just show the strength and the community roots that this organization already has.
So yeah, like, I mean,
and
I got this story here.
Yeah.
But
if you want to give them an update.
Yeah, like, where are we now? Because I mean, that is an amazing flex. And
I just love the tactics, right? And this is how you do like bold and courageous and creative politics, and leverage the power and position that you have. Yeah, but this I can go through it. What's next for Shama Sawant with November vote no longer likely, right? With the likelihood of a recall vote for Shama Sawant taking place in November quickly dwindling, several questions remain as to what comes next. That includes uncertainty surrounding signatures gathering efforts, when a vote is most likely to take place, and where the efforts currently stand, right? Signatures are due mid-October. And they're basically saying that they don't think they can do it, despite the fact that it seems like Shama Sawant and her team have collected enough signatures. But they said something along the lines of the person behind the recall campaign. They said that they want to do it on their own schedule and on the voters' schedule, and not on the schedule of Shama Sawant and her team, which is just them again. Showing that this is not a democratic referendum. This is not about trying to get the voice of the people and say, okay, we're going to rise up against an unpopular candidate. No, this is them trying to cynically use the tools that they have at their disposal and the legal opportunities that they have to undermine a democratically elected socialist who's been doing a hell of a lot for the people of Seattle.
And this is a wide thing. It's not just socialists, but also just reform DAs.
Yeah, that's true.
Original recall Chesa Boudin effort fails to get enough signatures, but it's this pro-carceral, big city corporate liberal, basically, right? Big money urban liberals are going to be increasingly a problem.
And let's not forget too that the crime starts way before it goes to the ballot. What these people are trying to do, and they've been trying to do with Shama Sawant from the get-go, is trying to slow her down, right? Because if you're constantly having to push back these kind of nonsensical attacks on your position, despite the fact that you are able to flex yourself as a movement and defeat them time and time again, you're spending resources, time, energy, attention constantly fighting against people who are trying to undermine democracy. And that's all that it is. They're trying to undermine democracy because people like Shama Sawant are doing something very different with their power than most politicians do. As Danny Bessner was saying earlier, most people, you vote, and like the idea is that, you basically get to choose between two pre-selected members of the ruling class, right? And this kind of politics is very different. It's taking advantage of that system and trying to find ways to squeeze working class power, right? They don't want that to happen, so they're trying to do everything that they can, one, to pull people out of power, and two, to make it so difficult for them to just do the basic aspects of the position that they're elected in.
Right, like it's great that Shama met this in such a way, and had the power and the sort of volunteer army to go collect signatures. They could have also been doing something positive. Yeah. And not defensive.
And I mean, they're continuing to do positive stuff. I don't want to make it seem like
absolutely.
They're not doing it, but I mean, look at all the stuff that they've been doing in the past 6 months, and imagine what they would be able to do if they weren't also having to focus a lot of their energy making sure that they don't have the position robbed from them in some kind of anti-democratic stuff.
Precisely.
So, the thing is, like, the threats to democracy, despite what Mike Lindell and Trump think, are not the machines or the secret packets or whatever. It's rich people.
Yeah.
And it's been that way for a very long damn time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that do we want to talk about Obama on oil, or should we save that?
We can do that in the post game.
So we have a few other things I want to tease in the post game. Elon Musk space advertisements. Woo. The innovation is coming. It's going to shower its benefits onto us, including a fucking Quip ad in space.
Quibi.
Yeah, exactly. Quibi. We need space Quibi. We're also talking about Yang. He says crypto is a potential vehicle to get to UBI, which is an interesting statement from that charlatan. Also, I want to talk about Rockstar Games and how whether labor needs to be coerced under a capitalistic system to create, or if this is a bit of an impediment, and it's ruining actually creativity. So
I'm looking forward to that.
Patreon.com/leftreckoning if you want to continue this journey with us. And
we'll be joined for a bonus episode on Sunday by Natalie Scher. We're going to be talking Epstein, the vaccine rollout, and much, much more. And I did just want to note for people who, obviously the climate change reports that we got have been absolutely horrific.
Right.
And I just wanted to note that I spent about an hour on that yesterday as well, talking about ways to try to beat, a kind of climate despair, and actually turning that into motivation for a radical politics for the future. We'll definitely do more on climate soon. I just wanted to note that, that we think that story is very important and we're not ignoring it tonight.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, we'll actually probably even get into it a little bit on the post game, but yeah, go check out David's stream from yesterday, folks. And patrons, we will see you in about 30 minutes with the post game.